We used to dare each other to get close to him. The scary man on the bench who talked to himself and jumped at car horns. Jimmy called him Psycho Pete and threw pebbles when he wasn't looking. We thought we were brave, thought we were funny, until the day 3 men with guns came to our playground, and the crazy man became the only thing standing between us and terror. Welcome to these Still Dare Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of judgment, courage, and hidden heroes, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today. And if you believe that heroes don't always look like we expect them to, hit that subscribe button and help us share stories that matter. The playground sat at the edge of Riverside Park, surrounded by old oak trees and a rusted chain-link fence that had seen better decades. Swings creaked in the afternoon breeze, and the monkey bars gleamed with fresh paint from the city's last renovation attempt. It was the kind of place where kids gathered after school, where mothers pushed strollers, and where teenagers skateboarded until the sun went down. But there was one constant that made everyone uncomfortable. The man on the bench. He showed up every day around 2 p.m., always the same bench, the one closest to the tree line. Dirty clothes, unshaven face, a torn military jacket that had faded from green to something closer to gray. He carried a brown paper bag that everyone assumed held a bottle. And sometimes he'd talk to himself, gesturing at invisible people, flinching when cars backfired or horns honked too loud. The kids called him different names. Some said Crazy Pete, others whispered Hobo Harry. The adults just called him that man and pulled their children a little closer when they walked by. Nobody knew his real name. Nobody asked. 8-year-old Tommy Richardson was the first to get close, not because he was brave, but because he'd lost his baseball behind the bench and was too scared to ask for help getting it back. He crept forward, expecting the man to yell or grab him, but instead, the stranger just pointed to the ball and said quietly, "It's behind the roses, son, watch the thorns." Tommy grabbed the ball and ran, but something about the man's voice stuck with him. It wasn't scary, it was sad. That's when the game started. Jimmy Patterson, 10 years old and the self-appointed leader of the playground, decided the man was entertainment. He dared the younger kids to get close, to shout things, to throw pebbles at the bench. Most of the kids were too scared, but Jimmy wasn't. He had an audience to impress. "Watch this," Jimmy would say, puffing out his chest. "I bet I can make him jump." He'd creep up behind the bench and slam his hands together like a firecracker. The man would flinch, sometimes knock over his paper bag, and Jimmy would run away laughing. The other kids would giggle nervously, not sure if they were supposed to be amused or ashamed. The man never fought back, never yelled. He'd just sit there, shoulders hunched, waiting for it to pass. Sometimes he'd pick up whatever Jimmy had thrown and set it aside without anger. Other times, he'd just close his eyes and wait for the world to stop spinning. One afternoon, in late September, Sarah Chen, who was 9 and smarter than most of the kids twice her age, watched the man flinch at a passing motorcycle and said, "Maybe he's sick." "He's not sick," Jimmy shot back. "He's just crazy. My dad says he's probably dangerous." But Sarah kept watching. She noticed things the others missed. The way the man's eyes constantly scanned the playground, not like someone looking for trouble, but like someone watching for it. The way he positioned himself on the bench to see all the entrances. The way he never fully relaxed, even when he seemed to be sleeping. "He's protecting us," she whispered to her friend Lisa one day. Lisa laughed. "From what?" "The squirrels." Sarah didn't answer, but she stopped participating in Jimmy's games. She started bringing an extra juice box and leaving it on the bench. When the man wasn't looking, she never saw him drink it, but it was always gone by the next day. The man's name was Marcus Webb. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, though nobody at the playground knew that. He'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, lost his best friend to an IED, and came home with wounds that didn't show on the outside. The bottle in the paper bag wasn't alcohol, it was medication that barely kept the memories at bay. The talking to himself was conversations with ghosts only he could see. He came to the playground because children's laughter was the only sound that didn't remind him of gunfire. He sat on that bench because it gave him a clear view of every entrance, every exit, every potential threat. Not because he was paranoid, but because 20 years of training doesn't just disappear because you're home. He endured the kids' taunts because he understood something they didn't. He'd rather be their monster than let them meet a real one. That day came on a Tuesday in October. The playground was unusually busy. The weather was perfect, not too hot, not too cold, and kids from 3 different elementary schools had converged for what felt like the season's last great outdoor day. Tommy and Sarah were on the swings. Jimmy was showing off on the monkey bars. A group of mothers sat on the other benches, chatting and keeping half an eye on their children. Marcus was in his usual spot, paper bag beside him, watching the tree line, with the kind of attention that looked like nothing but meant everything. At 3:47 p.m., a white van pulled up to the park's back entrance. 3 men got out. They moved wrong, to purposeful, to coordinated. One stayed by the van. The other 2 walked toward the playground with their hands in their jacket pockets. Marcus saw them before anyone else did. His posture changed instantly. The slouch, disappeared. The unfocused stare became laser sharp. He stood up slowly, never taking his eyes off the approaching men. The mothers were still talking. The kids were still playing. But Marcus had already calculated distances, cover positions, and escape routes. He'd identified the two biggest threats and was moving to intercept them before they reached the children. The first man was thin, nervous, sweating, despite the cool air. The second was bigger, calmer, more dangerous. Both had the shape of weapons in their pockets. They weren't here for the kids specifically. This was about territory. About sending a message to someone who owed money to the wrong people. But they'd chosen the playground because it was public, because it would make witnesses too scared to testify. They hadn't counted on Marcus. He intercepted them 20 feet from the swing set. Up close, he didn't look like the homeless drunk the kids had been mocking. He looked like exactly what he was, a soldier who'd found his ground and wouldn't. "Give it up, gentlemen," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made both men stop. "I think you're lost." The thin man laughed nervously. "Just passing through. Old man, mind your business." Marcus didn't move. "This is my business." The bigger man stepped forward, hand moving toward his pocket. "You don't want to do this, Pops. Walk away." That's when Marcus smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the kind of smile that said he'd been in this situation before, in places where the stakes were higher and the odds were worse. "Boys," he said, never raising his voice, "you picked the wrong playground." What happened next took less than 30 seconds. The thin man went for his weapon first. Marcus moved faster than someone his age should have been able to, faster than someone who'd been sitting on a bench drinking should have been able to. He disarmed the first man with a movement that looked effortless and left the attacker on the ground, conscious but very much rethinking his life choices. The second man was more dangerous, but Marcus had been dealing with more dangerous men for 20 years. It ended with the attacker's weapon in Marcus's hand and the attacker face down in the dirt, arm twisted behind his back at an angle that suggested he wouldn't be using it for a while. The third man, the one by the van, saw what had happened and made the smart choice. He got in the van and drove away, leaving his partners to contemplate their decisions. The entire fight, if it could be called that, happened in near silence. Marcus never shouted, never lost control. He simply neutralized two threats with the kind of precision that comes from too much practice. When it was over, he secured both weapons, checked the men for additional threats, and only then looked up. At the playground, every child was staring at him. The mothers had called 911. Tommy's mouth was hanging open. Sarah was nodding, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected all along. Jimmy Patterson, the boy who'd thrown pebbles and called him crazy, was crying. Marcus looked at the kids for a long moment. Then he smiled, a real smile this time, tired but genuine, and said, "Everyone okay?" They nodded mutely. "Good," he said. "That's all that matters." When the police arrived, they found two suspects secured and disarmed, a dozen witnesses who could barely speak, and one very calm veteran sitting on his bench, hands visible, waiting to explain what had happened. The investigation was brief. Security cameras caught most of it. The two attackers had outstanding warrants. The weapons were illegal. Marcus had acted in defense of others, and every witness confirmed it. But more importantly, the neighborhood had finally seen Marcus Webb for who he really was. The next day, when Marcus showed up at his usual time, the playground was different. The kids didn't run away. The mothers didn't pull their children closer. Jimmy Patterson, who'd spent weeks tormenting the man he'd called crazy, walked straight up to the bench and said, "I'm sorry, sir." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. For what? For being mean? For not knowing? Marcus nodded slowly. "You're just a kid. You weren't supposed to know." Tommy Richardson brought Marcus a sandwich his mother had made. Sarah Chen brought him a proper coffee in a thermos. Other kids brought drawings, thank you notes, and questions they'd been too scared to ask before. "Were you a soldier?" one little girl asked. "I was," Marcus said. "A good one." Marcus was quiet for a long time. "I tried to be." Within a week, everything had changed. The paper bag was gone, replaced by a proper water bottle and actual lunch. The torn jacket was replaced by a clean coat donated by someone who'd heard the story. The bench had a small plaque that read, "In honor of those who watch over us." Marcus still came to the playground every day, still sat on the same bench, still watched the entrances and exits. But now, he wasn't alone. Kids would sit with him, ask him about his service, listen to carefully edited stories about faraway places. He never told them about the nightmares. Never mentioned the friends who didn't come home. Never explained why he flinched at loud noises or why he needed to sit where he could see everything. But he didn't have to. The children understood something the adults had taken too long to figure out. Sometimes the people who look the most broken are the ones holding everything together. Jimmy Patterson, the boy who'd called him Psycho Pete, became one of his most regular visitors. He'd bring his homework and ask Marcus to check his math. He'd share stories about school and friends and dreams of becoming a soldier himself someday. One afternoon, as Jimmy was getting ready to leave, he asked, "Mr. Webb, Why did you let me be mean to you? Marcus thought about it for a long time. Because you're a kid, Jimmy. You're supposed to be able to be a kid. That's why people like me do what we do. Jimmy nodded like he understood, though he probably didn't, not yet, but he would. Sarah Chen, who'd suspected all along that Marcus was more than he appeared, asked him a different question. When you were watching us, were you scared? Every day, Marcus admitted, but not of you. For you, she smiled. That's what I thought. The mothers who'd once whispered about the dangerous man on the bench now brought him coffee and included him in their conversations. They learned that he'd been a medic as well as a soldier, that he'd saved more lives than he'd ever talk about, and that he'd been living in a small apartment 2 blocks away, not on the streets like they'd assumed. One of them, a nurse named Patricia, offered him a job at the hospital. We need someone who stays calm under pressure, she said. Marcus considered it. I don't know if I'm ready for that. You've been ready, she said. You just needed someone to ask. He started the following Monday. During the day, he worked at the hospital. In the afternoons, he still came to the playground. Not because he was homeless or had nowhere else to go, but because it had become his post, his responsibility. The kids still called him by name. Now, not Crazy Pete or Psycho Pete or that man. They called him Mr. Webb, or sometimes just Marcus. And when new kids came to the playground, the regulars would point to the bench and say, "That's Marcus. He keeps us safe." Because that's what he did, what he'd always done, even when nobody knew it, even when nobody thanked him for it, even when the people he was protecting called him names and threw pebbles at his back. He watched over them because that's what soldiers do. They stand, watch, so others can sleep. They face the darkness so others can enjoy the light. They carry the weight so others can play. Marcus Webb had come home from war broken, medicated, and alone. But he'd found his purpose on a playground bench, watching over children who didn't know they needed watching. The 3 men who'd come to the playground that day had expected to find easy targets and frightened witnesses. Instead, they'd found a guardian who'd been waiting his whole life for that moment, the moment when all his training, all his sacrifice, all his pain would finally mean something. He'd been called crazy, dangerous, a drunk, and a dozen other names, but when it mattered, when the real danger came, he'd been exactly what the playground needed. A protector who never asked for thanks, a hero who never needed recognition, a soldier who never stopped serving. So I ask you now, have you ever judged someone too quickly? Have you ever seen someone struggling and assumed they were broken rather than strong? Have you ever met someone like Marcus Webb, someone who looked like nothing but was everything when it mattered? Tell us their story in the comments. Say their name, because the world is full of people like Marcus, sitting on benches and standing in corners, watching over us while we go about our lives. They don't ask for our gratitude. They don't need our approval, but they deserve our respect. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we get to see them for who they really are before it's too late. Thank you for watching The Human Stories. If this story touched you, subscribe and share it. Help us make sure that the Marcus Webbs of the world are never invisible again. Their silence was earned. Now it's time we speak for them. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, if you see someone sitting alone on a bench, watching over others, don't assume they're broken. They might just be the strongest person in the room.